Everyone has a life story to tell, but an incredible life story is shared and told differently.
I've been told that in the early parts of the 20th century, a British historian did say that the past is a foreign country and they do things differently there. Tonight, on our program, Incredible Life Stories with Simon Kasyate, we're going to speak history. Not just history, but the history of a beloved country, Uganda, bits of the political history of the country, and bits of the religious history of this country. But in all this history being told and shared, there is a gentleman who has decided to dedicate his life, or at least a big part of his life today, to do research about the history of Uganda. I'm pleased to have him on the program. Tukwaniriza ku program yafe omwami o Professor Derek Peterson.
Hey, kulamusiza nnyo. Nemusanyufu nnyo okufuna obudde okusisikana nawe.
Professor Derek Peterson is a professor of history at the University of Michigan in the United States of America. And previously, he worked at the University of Cambridge in the United Kingdom, where he too was in the Department of History, and he's currently running 3 projects about the history of Uganda, and he has had a couple of exhibitions in this country, one about Uganda at 60, looking at the 60 years of independent Uganda, another about Idi Amin, and most recently, he's running one on the Uganda matters, where he has collaborated, worked with different stakeholders to bring back the relics of our beautiful country in regard to these 3 projects. Let's start with the incredible work that you are doing about Uganda's history. Broadly, just share with us your body of work.
Well, I started working as a historian of Uganda in the early parts of the 21st century. I had previously been largely based in Kenya as a scholar. I began working with the regional government in Western Uganda to digitize government archives in Kabarole district, especially with Mountains of the Moon University, which is a regional, it was then a local council university, it's now a government institution. And over the course of the past 20 years, MMU, with bits of help from Michigan, my university, and other institutions, has digitized it's the largest single archive of digitized government documents in Africa, and it's based in Fort Portals, this regional university in Fort Portal. And it's largely down to its credit to the achievements of people and colleagues at MMU, with bits of help from me along the way. That's where I kind of got into what you might call public history. That is scholarship that has a dimension that faces toward a public other than other scholars. So out of that work, in 2017, myself and colleagues from Australia began working with the Uganda Broadcasting Corporation to digitize their analog media assets, old photographs, sound recordings, cinema films, some vinyl as well we've been working with. Wow. So we've been able, since 2018, to digitize about 50,000 still photographs that date from the 60s through to the 1980s, along with sound recordings and cinema film. And this is in turn given myself and colleagues here material to work with to put on exhibitions at the Uganda Museum and now also here at Uganda Martyrs University. Because now, for the first time, there are audiovisual materials that interest a wider public. The general public is not that interested in archives per se, but visual material, photographs bring you closer to historical characters. So we've been able to organize these exhibitions following on from the digitization of the UBC archive in particular. One in 2019 was called The Unseen Archive of Idi Amin.
Idi Amin, yes.
That was on show from 2019 to 2020 in Kampala and also in Arua and Soroti. Then we got COVID, of course, and everything closed down. So then we did another show in 2022 called Uganda at 60, which was a very widely attended occasion in which His Excellency came to the Uganda Museum to open the exhibition. And now I'm working with colleagues here to lay on an exhibition that's opening today about the history of the Uganda martyrs, whose relics we've just brought back from Rome. Yeah.
When you look at the body of work of the historic interest that you pick in a country like Uganda, for you particularly as a scholar coming in from Nether, what are some of the highlighting exquisite, or should I say, the things that really stand out for you looking at the history of this country that so much drew you to get into this project with both feet in the water?
Uganda's history, as all Ugandans know, is complicated and traumatic, violent. For many people, until recently, history was something to be forgotten. In 1986, when the NRM came to power, the view was we should forget the past. It's embarrassing, it's dark, full of violence.
Death,
Why would you
destruction.
study history? Until recently, the president took much the same view. Why would you read history at the university? And yet, as a scholar and as a kind of observer, as a friend of many people here in Uganda, I came to realize that history is always present, even though in public government until recently was disinterested in engaging with it. So myself and my colleagues here in Makerere, in the museum, at UBC, in Uganda Martyrs University, and in Mountains of the Moon, have been working to try to open up pathways to understand different parts of this vexing history, because we think it's still present. The traumas of the 1970s and 80s
Are still present today.
need to be remembered today.
If for nothing else, what say never again, maybe?
Exactly. 75% of Ugandans have been born since 1986. And it's incumbent on us as historians and students of history, not necessarily to make the past, we don't want to impose upon all Ugandans the obligation to study history, but to open up venues where the unresolved tensions and traumas of the past can be discussed, deliberated over, and a path forward can be found. That's what we're trying to do. Yeah.
As a scholar for more than 3 decades, you possibly have also studied histories of other places.
Yeah.
And if you look at that in terms of comparison to the Ugandan history projects that you're running and much of the body of knowledge that you've acquired about history, globally, and I also reckon that you have quite a body of work with regards to history of this region, the East African region.
I do, yeah.
Why are you, if I would ask you, why do you so much feel a bigger attachment to Ugandan history than all the other body of work? Because I can read it from how you speak about Uganda's history.
Yeah.
And also the interest in picking up a local language and being able to speak it,
Hey,
or at least to survivable levels.
Gezako.
Oh, Gezako, yeah.
Okay, so I began working as a historian of Africa in the early 90s, largely in Kenya. As a student, I went to Kenya for the first time in 1991 and was drawn into Kenya's history because I came to know a pastor in southern Kenya near Narok, a Maasai pastor who was extraordinarily humble, who lived in very difficult circumstances and yet was so energetic in his preaching of the Christian gospel. And that experience led me into an interest in the history of East African Christianity.
Oh,
So
okay.
my earliest work was about central Kenya's history of religion. Later, I wrote a book about the history of the East African revival,
Oh,
the Tuku Tendereza movement.
the Tendereza movement.
Tuku Tendereza Yesu, that one. Many of your viewers' grandparents will have been, or will have known, Balokole as they're called.
Absolutely.
So I wrote a book about the history of the Balokole movement,
Wow.
and that involved research in Tanzania, Kenya, and Uganda. And that's how I started coming
parts
here.
of DRC.
At DRC, Rwanda, Burundi as well, Sudan. It was a very important movement right across the East African region. So
That is an incredible life story.
it is. So I came to Uganda to do research on the revival, and I realized there was really lots of work to do, particularly around conserving government archives, which at that time were badly kept. The story has changed more recently, but in the early 2000s, government archives here were in a dire state. And I felt almost like an obligation. I had resources. I was then teaching at Cambridge University. I had resources.
And you did it for free.
I did. I had resources, interest, colleagues to work with, an institution, both Makerere and
UBC.
and first of all, Mountains of the Moon, later UBC. So it's been kind of like a combination of my Ugandan friends and colleagues' interest and enthusiasm and the resources that I am able to bring.
Professor Peterson, on the program, Incredible Life Story of Simon Kasyate, we ask a few personal tidbits on getting to know you even better. As a scholar, I would say you have read more books than possibly I can count the hairs on my head. However, what's the best book you have read ever?
Well, that would be Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude, which is a fantastic magical realist book that speculatively suggests what history in Latin America might have been like in a kind of magical world. For me, it's improbability of Marquez's literature is what I find so exciting as a historian. Yeah.
We'll take a short break. When we return, it's more about the incredible life story of Professor Derek Peterson, a professor of history who is working on incredible projects to preserve the history of our beautiful country and bits of it, including and not limited to politics and religion.
An incredible life story is shared and told differently.
Incredible life story with Simon Kasyate. On the program tonight is Professor Derek Peterson, a professor of history from the University of Michigan, but who is working collaboratively with friends, he calls them, institutions, and other people of goodwill to preserve the history of our beautiful country. He has run 3 projects, include the digitization of government archives, looking at 60 years of Uganda, looking at the unseen archives of President Idi Amin, and now just leading a new one, the relics of the Ugandan matters, which has collaboratively worked with different stakeholders to bring them down from the Holy See. Derek, now let's get to know you even a little more. Who are you? Where were you born and when were you born?
I was born in 1971 in upstate New York. My parents are by no means people of the world. My mom's a nurse, my dad's retired. Going to East Africa as a student, as I did in the early 90s, was really new terrain for me and for my family.
How did you get down to find East Africa being your first destination in your scholarly life? Did you spin the globe and pick a pinpointed destination? Or there must have been something that drew you down here? Or was it parents saying, Derek, maybe get down to East Africa?
Like many students at universities, I didn't know really what the heck I was doing when I began my university studies. So I was a music student, I was a journalism student. Around that time, South Africa was democratizing. This is in the early 90s. I first wanted to go to South Africa, but in the early 90s, the politics of South Africa were very fraught and violent. So I came to Kenya in 1991 after my second year of university. Very innocent, very untrained, with almost no particular knowledge of anything. And as I said earlier, had the opportunity to live with a very impressive pastor in a remote part of Maasai land, and that really changed the way I saw the world.
When one mentions the remote part of Maasai land, I mean, Maasai land is, well, to anyone's imagination, quite a hard place to live in. Now, when you talk about the remote part of it, it must have been even harder for you coming in from Europe. Let's talk about the food, for example, the weather, the general way of life. How were you able to pick up your life and get assimilated in there in that short time?
Well, when I was younger, I have to say I'm not a great fan of ugali. I don't want to offend anyone who loves posho on your program.
Don't worry, I am exactly like you. I had enough of that in high school.
Yes.
I only hope I never get to eat it.
It's sort of starvation food. Posho was introduced in East Africa as the rations for army men in World War I. It's not an indigenous food. Matoke is an indigenous food, but not posho.
So what were the people in Kenya eating before this was introduced here?
People in Kenya were eating much more nutritious things like millet and beans and other such things that give you more nutritional value. Posho is a disaster. Again, I'm going to offend lots of people. Posho is a disaster, as is, Kenyans love this dish called githeri, particularly people who speak Kikuyu around central Kenya. It's beans and kasoli, ebijanjaro na kasoli. It's almost inedible in my view. Coming to Uganda for me has been a liberation. It's a big relief. I started working living in Uganda and Jagale Media Baganda Nyo. I love matoke, I love binyebwa, I love karo. Karo is my favorite one. Karo na binyebwa is that, and fish, if you can put some dried fish.
Some dried fish.
Yes, that's my favorite one.
With kalo.
Yes, that's my favorite, yes.
And how do you love to wash that down? Have you tested some of
Ugandan beer? I generally drink a bell, yes.
A bell?
Yes, cold. So I know again, I'll offend. People will say it's a woman's beer, but I like that one. Yes.
You have no idea just how much we have in common.
Really?
That's my favorite beer as well.
Excellent, yes. You can drink it and you don't end up flat on your back. It's
Absolutely.
Good. Yes, right.
Incredible. And the weather? How do you find East African weather? And maybe making a comparison between Kenya and Ugandan weather, because clearly it must be some lines to draw.
Similar, yeah. I mean, one thing, regardless of where you are in East Africa, it's almost always better than either in Britain, where I used to live, or in Michigan, where I live now. In Britain, one rarely saw the sun. People are pale and pasty, their teeth rot from not being able to be outside and eat good food. Michigan, the weather's better, but Still, the fact that we can always more or less sit outside here, except maybe during the rainy season, and have dinner and enjoy the sun is just tremendously good for your sense of identity. Like being outside is a wonderful thing. And Ugandans benefit from it greatly, this beloved and fantastic climate. Yeah.
As a very busy scholar, one would imagine you do not have any other thing that you do for recreation. Do you listen to music, for example? Love some music? And if so, what genre of music do you love to listen to?
Well, I'm a saxophone player.
Oh.
And I also sing.
Yeah, man of so many talents.
Yeah, as I was saying, I was once a music student. So with music, I love listening to jazz. John Coltrane is my musical paragon. I also sing in an Anglican church choir. I sing bass, and I enjoy that very much. And I enjoy sports too. I like playing volleyball and other basketball is another sport that I enjoy.
Well, from your height, clearly basketball should come
Yes.
almost naturally. We'll be right back. It's Incredible Life Stories with Simon Kasyate. Professor Derek Peterson with us on the program, a historian of great acclaim, an author, and everything in between.
An incredible life story is shared and told differently.
Incredible Life Stories. I have with me Professor Peterson. Incredible Life Stories, and I have with me Professor Derek Peterson, a historian of great acclaim. And just as we're in the break, he did let out a little secret, and here it is. Expound more on that little secret. You are publishing a book about Idi Amin, coming out pretty much soon. What's that book looking at that possibly the world hasn't seen today about Idi Amin?
So the title is A Popular History of Idi Amin.
The popular history of Idi Amin.
Uganda nga ebyafaayo bya abawanansi oba aba edda simanyi abantu babulijjo mu ekiseera kya Idi Amin naye
ebyafaayo by'abantu ba bulijjo mu kiseera kya Idi Amin.
kituufu omanyi Oluganda bulungi nnyo.
Tegeera.
So it's based on the research that we've been doing, that I've been doing as a scholar in local government archives around the country. And it tries to bring to life Ugandans in the 1970s who were not close to central government, but who were inspired and who worked hard to bring Idi Amin's ideals to life. The story of the 1970s generally is one of violence and trauma, murders, terror. All of that is true, Simon. The book does not in any way deny the fact of violence. The point, though, that the book makes is that a great number of Ugandans in those years were inspired, particularly in the early 70s, by the prospect of liberation that Idi Amin held out for Ugandans, for black Ugandans in particular. Idi Amin portrayed himself and was believed by many Ugandans to be bringing freedom to Uganda's economy and to Uganda's culture in a time in which many people felt that outsiders had too much control over state institutions and over public culture.
And of course, business and popularity is the expulsion of Ugandans of Asian origin and the like.
Yes.
And so in this research, you did put together not just thoughts, but testimonies of some of the folks that you actually did meet.
Yes, I've done a lot of interviews. I've also worked in a lot of government archives. The book is organized around, it's largely about civil servants and artists, curators, other people who were not in government, who dedicated themselves, who actually sacrificed themselves to bring these ideals to life, even as the world around them was becoming more and more violent. And it's this irony that even as so many people were suffering, at the same time, so many people found reasons to be inspired by Idi Amin's government. It's that unlikely juxtaposition of terror and inspiration. That's the subject of the book.
There's actually a lot of popular talk around to say that if he possibly had been around longer, would have seen some, for example, major infrastructure built. People talk about the International Conference Center, which he just said, it shall be because the next 2 years I'm hosting the Organization of African Union, Unity, Congress, or then the blueprint for Nambola Stadium, Idi Amin as a brainchild. Color TV, which now we're able to jump onto the highway of modernity, Idi Amin. So in your research, do you pick up the thing about Idi Amin as an impulsive, well-meaning guy who possibly had everything with good intention, but maybe the execution and certain other forces that may have been even exterior, possibly, disrupted the way he was governing the country?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really in the book take sides on Ugandan's ongoing interest about whether he was good or bad.
Okay.
That's not really what the book is about. Instead, what it tries to do is to bring into focus people who were not really in the government, but who found reasons to be enthusiastic about it. And there were lots of reasons. And today, in fact, when I've been writing this book, I find in writing about this reasons to myself be enthusiastic about the goals that he set out. It's worth saying that African Americans and other Africans looked upon Uganda for a time as a kind of pioneering state that was modeling what it would mean for black people globally to be liberated from the influence of colonial and racial imperialism. Remember that this was the middle of the anti-apartheid struggle,
Yes, exactly.
the struggle against the Rhodesian government. In the United States, black Americans were fighting against racism. Idi Amin, for a time, was a kind
And of course the Palestinian
a
question
hero.
was still there as well, and he also
Yeah.
took some sides there.
So it's more, the book is about what other people made of him. It doesn't really try to adjudicate whether or
Whether
not
it was bad or good.
good or bad. That's too, I think it's too simple a question.
That's an interesting way to start. But tell me something about yourself, Professor Peterson. Many of us go to school with the ambition of, pursuing courses that then will eventually give us jobs that are fulfilling, dignified, but most importantly, that are heavily rewarding in terms of money.
Sure, yeah.
Tell me about being a historian. Do you find the kind of work you do very rewarding financially?
No, of course not. No, that's not the point.
Then why do you do it? Then one asks them, why are you doing it?
No one gets rich off of being a historian, Simon. Perhaps journalism would be a more lucrative career, I don't know, but
Journalism isn't.
I
that's why
don't
I'm saying,
imagine
yeah.
so, yes, no. Our students at the University of Michigan generally do pretty well financially. The numbers that we've looked at suggest that students of history in graduating from our university within a few years are making more than engineering students or business students.
Wow.
Doing a business undergraduate degree in Michigan or indeed at Kasyate is, in my view, a waste of time. No offense, but I don't know if you studied business.
No, I studied, social sciences.
Excellent. I have no, to your viewers, I'm sorry if I've offended anyone, but it's important as a student to learn critical thinking and how to write, how to assemble evidence, how to make an argument. This is a skill that's transportable regardless of what job you do.
Wow.
So in a history degree, the whole discipline, regardless of whether it's Kasyate, Chambogo, Michigan, wherever, the emphasis is on inviting students to work out how to assemble evidence so as to create a convincing argument about it. And that skill applies as much to interpreting history as it does to interpreting our contemporary world. It's a transferable skill that many people find useful over the course of life, whether or not it makes them rich.
I love that. And, but arguments have been made that, yes, if you study history, then what job do you do? What would you say to people who say, you're a graduate of history, for example, you have no job?
So the opportunities that confront, the limited opportunities that confront students of Kasyate finishing their degrees in the arts or in the social sciences, I'm aware that it's a different job market here than it is in the States. In the States, students of history generally do pretty well. Here, there's constraints on the opportunities that students come away with. I think what I'd encourage your viewers who are parents perhaps wondering what their students, their kids ought to study, is to recognize that education is a value that lives with you your whole life, regardless of what job you have, and that the training that one receives as a historian or as a student of social science both can enrich your life and also lead you into a whole number of careers, whether in law, in economics, in business that is, in teaching, that will be valuable and important and will enrich you, as I was saying, over the course of it. So I'd encourage all of your viewers not to regard history as a kind of dead letter or as a kind of dead end, because it's a great source of it furnishes your life with the furniture by which to think critically and innovatively about the world around you.
No one has ever told me the things that you just told me about pursuing some of these courses. I feel very much honored. So tell me, tell us something about yourself with regard to a life mantra. Do you have a mantra for your life, or a motto, or a slogan by which you live? And if so, which one is this?
I'm
Many of
afraid
us
I
will
don't have
say
the slogan.
you only live once.
That's not really, I don't know. I think that that if I had a mantra, it would be something like, and I don't really have a mantra, but I try to be consistent insofar as I can, to use resources that I have for the public interest. I teach at a public university in the States. I've tried, as I've gotten more established in my life and in my career, to harness resources that I have to enable others to find paths by which to understand their own histories, particularly here in Uganda and in Kenya. And also in Michigan. My students benefit from the work that I do here. So, I don't know, one often thinks about, a career as being about enriching yourself, finding a way to secure your retirement, and I think that's all important. I don't want to denigrate that, but I've greatly been enriched over the past 25 years now by the opportunities I've had to bring resources and ideas and materials together to create exciting venues for understanding history, like this exhibition that's about to open.
Tremendous. We'll be right back.
An incredible life story is shared and told differently.
It's Incredible Life Story with Simon Kasyate. On the program tonight, Professor Derek Peterson, a historian and author. He says he plays the saxophone. He's very sporty, tall guy, he's over 6 feet, and therefore he plays basketball as a default setting. And yes, sharing with us his incredible life story. Do you have a family, Derek?
I do, yes. I've got a child named Babazi. And
A child named?
Babazi.
Babazi?
Yes, yes.
The inspiration being a local politician in Uganda, or what could have been?
People often ask me if I named her after the former prime minister, and I did
See?
not, yes.
And is that true?
I have nothing against Amama and Babazi. However, she was born while I was doing research that led toward a book about the East African revival, about the Bolokole.
The Tukutendereza movement.
Tukutendereza. And the name Babazi was invented by Luchiga and Chinyoro speaking people who wanted to find names that could replace the old depressing names that their contemporaries were using. The 1930s were a time in Western Uganda where lots of children were dying early in life. And the names that Banyoro and Batoro and Bachiga gave to their children were often very depressing. This one will surely die, that sort of thing. So they invented, the Balokole invented these names.
That were positive.
That were positive.
That were giving life.
Exactly, giving confidence about this child's future. And I found that inspiring. It happened that my daughter was born as I was finishing the book, and my wife and I found lots to be inspired in the revival. So that's how she got her name.
The name Babazi.
With Mbabazi, yes.
Wow, that's very interesting. But
Yes,
finding a purely Caucasian young girl named Mbabazi.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Oh, wow. And now have you made known to her what her name actually means and the motivation behind it?
Yeah, no, she's very much aware of it. She'll
She
come
loves
to
it.
appreciate it more as she gets older, I'm sure. But yes.
Wow, interesting. And what does your wife do? Is she a scholar like yourself?
Yeah, she's an engineering professor at Michigan.
Oh, the University of Michigan.
Yes.
Just
yeah.
like you.
Yeah.
Wow. So the dining table or dinner time conversations in your family are heavily intellectual, very academic, or do you try to do something together outside your very demanding academic rigors?
I would say we don't have particularly high-flown dinner table conversations, I'm afraid, Simon. Perhaps in that way maybe you'll give me inspiration for setting up a seminar program over the dinner table. But I'm afraid it's more often about who's going to take care of this part of the job of being a family, like yourself, like your viewers. I'm sure there's a lot of work that goes into being an adult, a member of a community, a member of a church, a teacher at the university, and keeping all of it straight is always a challenge.
That also leads me to my next question, because you seem to be juggling so many balls in the air. You were a professor running different collaborations with different universities across miles from each other. And then, of course, you've got a wonderful daughter to raise, you've got a family to keep, and everything in between. How are you able to keep the balls all up in the air without dropping any?
Well, some of them get dropped, of course. That's true for myself as for everybody else. But having colleagues with whom you can work that help you stay on schedule. I have a lot of very good colleagues at Michigan and here in Uganda with whom I can collaborate. So it doesn't fall. This particular exhibition is very much the work of colleagues here at the Uganda Martyrs University. David Ngendo Chimba in particular is the lead curator, and his work and dedication has made it easy for me to come in and apply my expertise and resources to enrich the project more generally. Yeah.
Future prospects, Derek. What are you looking at after this now? Well, we know already you're going to publish a book about Idi Amin.
Yeah.
What else can we expect from your almost insatiable bag of incredible research and findings? And
Some of your viewers will remember earlier this year in June, we brought back from England 39 historical relics that had been in the university in Cambridge, in the museum there, for the past 120 years.
when you say relics, exactly what exact items are you talking about, for example?
Well, when we discussed the project in public, as we did in June, we highlighted a couple of objects. There was among them 4 or 5 pots from Ankole that were acquired by a collector named John Roscoe
Pots.
in 1904 that are richly decorated in a style that Banyankole today don't recognize. We've been doing research in the past couple of months about the history of design and fabrication of pottery in southern Uganda to try to work out where this novel artistic form might have come from and what it might tell us about the pots making and their makers. There were other objects that we brought back. Among others, we highlighted a drum from Bunyoro that's said to have been a royal drum acquired by the collector John Roscoe in 1910 and taken to Cambridge. Among other things, this drum is said to have been used. There's said to have been the blood of a Ganda chief who was murdered across it as it was being made or being renewed, perhaps being recovered. So what we're doing now is researching in Uganda's government archives in Wandagea to work out what the archival record can tell us about the history of Bunyoro, 1907, 1908, 1909. Was there a murder of a Ganda chief that involved a drum? And it turns out that there's lots of archival material that we can use to help shed light on these objects, what they meant, how they came to be collected. The thread that runs through all of it, if I could put it to you, is that all of these objects that we've brought back were relics that reflect the violence of the early 20th century, that shed light on colonial government and how Uganda came to be a colony, and shed light also on the injustices of colonial rule. That's the story we're going to tell. The plan is that in 2025 or 26, we'll put these objects on show at the Uganda Museum in an exhibition that will bring them to light for Ugandans to see and learn from. Yeah.
Let's put it this way, like the Americans say, it looks like from you, we ain't seen no nothing yet.
There we are.
There's plenty of stuff that you have on your sleeve for, especially the history of this country. It's been a pleasure having you on the program to share with us your incredible life story. And without a doubt, we'll keep an eye on all your projects because we are as interested as you are and your colleagues to look at the history of our country. After all, on here, we tell our incredible life stories.
Thank you very much for having me here, Simon. I appreciate it.
Let's go back to the relics a little bit, just to what's the repatriation process like? Is it an intergovernment conversation? Because if they're in Cambridge, where they were stored at the University of Cambridge, which is a public university. So to get them back to Uganda, what are the protocols involved?
As we discussed in June this year, the objects came from the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Cambridge. We were able to arrange for their return because the Uganda Museum and the museum in Cambridge worked directly together to organize a long-term loan by which these objects will come back to this country. The money for the return of these objects, which required a lot of funds to ship them, to pay for insurance, to cover the research costs, and to pay for the exhibition that's going to come in the next few years. The money came from Michigan, which is my university, and from the Andrew Mellon Foundation in the US. It wasn't an initiative that came from Uganda's government, but government will need to be involved now that they're here, because we want to lodge a claim for the transfer of ownership so that these objects will become the property of the Uganda Museum. So right now we're working with the Ministry of Tourism to organize for a formal claim for the transfer of title of these 39 relics.
That's interesting.
From Cambridge to Uganda, yeah.
Usually when we talk about repatriation of relics, there's normally that elephant in the room that's never really loudly spoken about, but people seem to think these were stolen from here and taken.
Yeah.
But is it always the case? Like, in the case of these relics that you're collecting about history of Uganda that were picked by a collector, was he a collector or he was some kind of Robin?
It's an interesting question. At the time, earlier this year, we launched this project. Many Ugandans said, these are our things, they were stolen from us. In fact, the archival records we have shows that most of them were paid for. Some of them were stolen, a few. But as Ugandans will see when we lay out the whole history of these objects when we do the exhibition in a year or two, many of them were purchased by collectors, by British collectors, from people whose identities, whose professions, whose political lives had been devalued by colonial rule. So it's not to say that there's not injustice behind the acquisition of these objects by British collectors. The people who sold them to John Roscoe and other collectors had been disorganized by colonial rule. Some of them were practitioners of traditional religion, others of them were experts in older ways of older technologies or older sort of ways of building communities. In the early 20th century, with the rise of Protestant Christianity and Catholicism, the Buganda kingdom and other of Uganda's kingdoms was reorganized around an aristocracy that was Christian. And that, in turn, meant that the shrine priests, the practitioners of the old religion, the experts of the old technologies were made redundant. And it's that change that made it possible for collectors to buy these things very cheaply from the people whose professions had been devalued by colonialism. That's the story. Daudi Mpanga, who's my friend and colleague, often talks about Uganda needing to develop a central nervous system by which one will recognize as a Musoga what you share with a Muganda or an Acholi person. This research we're doing on these 39 relics, I hope will allow us to tell a story about the shared dislocations and violence of colonial government so as to help Ugandans see that colonial rule formed Uganda, and it's actually through that violence and through sort of the recovery of that history that Uganda can see what you all share with each other and what future you might have together too.
Professor Derek Peterson, it's been a pleasure having you on the program.
Pleasure, yeah. Glad to be here.
Everyone has a life story to tell, but an incredible life story is shared and told differently.